Welcome everyone to our Community Connects event here. I'm just gonna do a quick introduction and pass it off. So this is really a collaboration across multiple organizations and agencies in response to the murder of George Floyd and the national response to that. A lot of different representatives from across the state came together to say we wanted to do something and provide some programming that gave a space for conversation and dialogue on topics that we felt were incredibly important. And so we identified some key topics being stolen land, stolen labor, and stolen lives. So I'm going to introduce here Alice Glenn, who is infamous in the area for her Coffee and Quaq podcast, and she's our host here. So I'll hand it off to her.
Thank you, Taylor. Can you all hear me okay? Mm-hmm. Sometimes I have a little bit of trouble with my mic. Okay. Paglarivsi, everybody, welcome. Uvanga Kanik. I'm Alice Kanik Glenn. Savaktunga Kuperluquarlumi. I am the host and producer of the Coffee and Quaq podcast, and I am just one of the members of our Community Connects little organization that we kind of built within the last few weeks. And I was asked to host our discussion. Welcome to the third session of our three-part series on stolen land, stolen labor, stolen lives. This discussion will focus on the idea of stolen lives and how that shows up in the United States and in Alaska historically and even today. So I just wanted to share my screen to show you a quick overview of what we'll be focusing on. Share screen. Let's see. Okay, and so here's some information about who we are, Community Connects, what our mission is, what we're doing. Some of the speakers that we'll be engaging with today, and some of the organizations that we're all part of that created this event. And here's a quick agenda or run of show, I guess you can call it. And so what I'll do is I'll open with a land acknowledgement, and then from there I'll introduce our speakers. And then we'll just jump right into our panel discussion. We have a set of questions that we all composed together for our speakers. And so we'll have a discussion for about an hour, and then it might go a little bit longer because we have 4 speakers, but we'll try to keep it to about an hour, and then spend 20 to 30 minutes doing Q&A with anybody who's tuning in, listening, so that we can provide more engagement with our speakers for you all. And then at the end here, we have some resources available. This is going to be a panel discussion with our speakers, but then next week we will have another event that we've kind of dubbed the reflection discussion. So we're going to be covering a lot of different topics, some of it pretty heavy today. So we wanted to provide some time. So a week from today, we'll get together again. And this time it won't be a panel discussion. It'll just be anyone and everyone who listened in to this panel discussion, if they would like to share or reflect or debrief basically about everything that we'll be talking about today. So that'll be fun and hopefully enlightening. And yeah, and so if any of you would like any further resources on whatever topics that we covered today, please reach out to any one of us. Me, Taylor, Jocasta, Menica, like we're all here to facilitate this discussion and to be a resource for you all as well. So with that, I would like to recognize, acknowledge, and honor the Dena'ina Athabascan people who are the original stewards of this land. I'd like to honor the Dena'ina Athabascan people, past, present, and future, and recognize that we are on their land and that we really remember and think about the Dena'ina Athabascan people as we move through this conversation about stolen lives. And I encourage you all to think about what that might mean as we go through these discussions and have these conversations. And personally, I recognize that I'm able to live here in a healthy environment because of the Dena'ina Athabascan people caring for these lands and these waters, so that we might be able to live in a healthy environment to have these discussions. So I think that's important to recognize. And let's see. And then next, I'm gonna have to go back to my own agenda. What's going on? And then next I will introduce our speakers. So thank you all so much for tuning in. We appreciate your participation, and thank you specifically to our panel speakers. We know you could be anywhere and are probably super tired of Zoom, like many of us are. So thank you so much. I'd like to introduce our speakers here. We have 4 panel speakers. And the first is Kendra Kloster, who is the ED of Native Peoples Action and Native Peoples Action Community Fund. She's a mom and a member of the Public Safety Advisory Commission at the Municipality of Anchorage. NPA does a lot of advocacy work around Alaska Native people, Alaska Native tribes, and centers wellness in all of the things that they do. That's our first speaker. Our second speaker is, and this is in no specific order, our second speaker is Jim Labelle, who is a professor of business and public policy at UAA, a former Alaska Native Studies professor, and is a boarding school survivor. So thank you, Jim, for being one of our panel speakers. Our third speaker is Dr. Tony Biskup, and she currently works at ANMC, Alaska Native Medical Center, as a physician and is dual boarded in pediatrics and internal medicine. She's worked with refugees and in underserved areas around the world as a teacher, as a public health practitioner and physician for over 20 years. Thank you, Dr. Tony Biskup, for joining us here today. And the fourth speaker, I had to double check on how to pronounce, which I'm so glad I did. Issa Spatrisano, I hope I got that right. Good, okay, great. And she is the Catholic Social Services, Refugee Assistance and Immigration Services Program Director and State Refugee Coordinator. And she has a history of working in the nonprofit organization, in nonprofit organization management, and has a Master of Education focused in teacher and learning from UAA, teaching and learning maybe from UAA. Well, those are our speakers. We're super excited. Thank you all for taking the time to spend with us this evening. And I don't want to waste too much time because I know we have a lot of great stuff to cover here. And so I just wanted to thank you all for being here. And I'm going to share my screen again so we can get into our first question of the evening. Share screen. Okay, and here it is. So like I said earlier, our theme today is stolen lives. And we recognize that you all come from very diverse backgrounds and specialize in different areas. But we wanted to know from each one of you what comes to your mind when you hear stolen lives.
I don't know if there's a specific order. Should we just shout out?
Feel free to jump in.
Okay. Yeah, so I think for me, there are a lot of different layers to this, and it's across generations and continues to steal across generations. So, for example, you mentioned the boarding schools, and Jim, it sounds like as a survivor, which it's really interesting. I did not know that before now, but that's taking people. So basically, government sanctioned kidnapping, stealing children, forcing them into a certain type of living, a certain culture, certain language, etc., stealing any possible connections that they have to their own identity, as well as affecting the lives of their parents and the other family members. And I don't want to speak too much to that because I don't have that personal experience, and I'm hoping we'll hear more about that. But we've seen similar things happen at the border with children arrested, or basically, in my opinion, state-sanctioned kidnapping happening at the border, taking children as young as 1 year old from their mothers, and then not allowing them to reunite with family members, putting them into homes of people who they don't know at all, who have no relation to them, who don't know the culture, don't speak the language. So there's a lot of trauma that happens around all of this. And so even if once, let's say these children at the border, some of them have been reunited because of court order, but not all of them have. And but even for those who have been reunited, that period of weeks to months to even years that they were kidnapped and away from their families has significant serious impacts on their physical, social, emotional well-being, and that can last for the rest of their lives. So that's I think about that. I think about slavery and the impacts of that, disability adjusted life years. So again, kind of the impacts of just the traumas and how that impacts people's development cognitively and their ability to get jobs, to learn, etc. I'll stop there. I'm interested to hear what others have to say.
I'll chime in because you touched on one of the things that I think affects my world. So yeah, I'm the state refugee coordinator here at in the state of Alaska, which means I provide or oversee all the services that serve refugees residing here in the state of Alaska that have arrived through the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program. But we also serve a number of other individuals that fall under the Office of Refugee Resettlement's care, which includes asylees, as you mentioned, at the border, foreign-born victims of human trafficking, which is another population, of course, that would fall under the category of stolen lives, and Cuban Haitian entrants. And so, when I first read this, what I really was reminded of was I was once we were having a planning session, actually. You talk about colonization. We had a meeting where a nonprofit in town wanted to help refugee communities build nonprofits. And so they had this meeting where they explained to them how to build nonprofits. And it was really interesting. This group of men from Sudan, mostly lost boys, who had been resettled and been living in Alaska for a number of years, kept saying, well, why do we need a nonprofit? If someone is sick or hungry, we just collect money and then we just give it to them. And they were like, well, how do you track the money? And they were like, well, we don't track the money. If a person needs money, you just give it to them. I don't understand, what you're saying. And at the end of it, it was really interesting because they said, I think it was this idea that we well-intentioned, right? And I think what I'm trying to get at is we're often well-intentioned. And I watched this very well-intentioned thing try to ask an entire culture or group to change the way they viewed community to restart. And what actually happened in that was a statement that one of the Sudanese men said they said, the question was, don't you want to have a nonprofit to preserve your culture and your language and, everything else for your next generations, right? To preserve a way to do that. And he said, no matter what nonprofit I start, I don't have my rivers, I don't have my streams, I don't have my land, I don't have my language, unless I'm on my land. It doesn't make sense. Who we are doesn't make sense. We're from a tribal entity out of Sudan, and we faced a genocide, and we're the only people left. So no matter what we do, we'll never get back who we were at some point. We've lost that. And when I think about stolen lives, I think about that. I think about I work in a program that gives people, we say, their new opportunity. And I think the Refugee Resettlement Program does that, right? It gets people out of very dire, dangerous situations. But no person, really, that's a refugee or an asylee, made the choice to leave their land, their home, who they are, unless there was no other option left. right? Like that's not your first choice. None of us would make that as our first choice. And I would say a lot of immigrants also fall in that category. You know, the U.S. immigration system is quite complicated. And so when I saw that, I thought about him saying that, and I had been working in resettlement probably 5 years when I heard him say that, and I just understood so clearly what he meant by that. You know, that if you don't have the place you're from, you lose a piece of who you are. And so I think that probably, I wasn't here for the stolen lands conversation. I'm sure that was very valuable. I think it's tied, I think sometimes land is tied to lives. That to me is an important piece in my world that I think about often and how we provide services.
Thank you both. Jim or Kendra?
Yeah, I can jump in here a little bit. A few things that come to mind when I thought about this, and we talk about colonization. A little bit of background on me. My family, Rick Linkett, originally from the Wrangell area, and I'm here on Dena'ina lands. I've been here about 10 years or so. But I think about, the land that we're on, and everywhere we go in Alaska, you're on Indigenous land. And a lot of times that's not remembered. And so we think about colonization and what came in, and we talk about our stolen lands, and you're really stealing the lives of how we live our traditional way of life. A family, we grow up fishing, you grow living up on the land and berry picking, and now it's so regulated, and people were constantly on the defense of saying, when we have to get permissions to go hunt, we have to get permission to go feed our families. And we're constantly defending how we live our lives. And so that's one part of it that I really think of. I think about how my family, when colonization came in, and how it really changed our people. And a lot of the things that we talk about is, how do we return to balance? How do we have this balance in our life and in our work, and embrace our Indigenous culture in every single way? This is something my grandmother had always instilled in me since I was little. And I get to pass that to my daughter. But there's always a piece missing for me. And I think with many people is, I never got to learn my language. My grandmother never got to learn. There are so many things that we are missing, where you're just feeling like a little part of you it's missing, and it's really hard to get back. And because I've never had it, but I have that kind of hole, and how do you fill that? And so that's part of it. The other thing that really comes to my mind, and one of the first things that came to my mind when we talk about stolen lives, is we have a crisis happening in our state. Our missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and two-spirit relatives. This has been going on for far too long, and it's just recently I feel like we're pulling the blanket back, and we're showing people that we have a serious crisis here, and we need everybody to come together. The more I do this work, the more I work with other nonprofits, with my sisters, and in this, I learn more and more, and this is our heart work, is what I call it. It's super hard, but it needs to be done. And so we're constantly pulling the blanket back to say, we need to stand up for our aunties and for our sisters, and be that voice and be that advocate. So we're out. We're currently actually hosting a MMIWG2S virtual 5K run walk right now. We also hold events like self-defense classes. We do advocacy. We're doing, everything that we can where we address our healing and our wellness, but also letting people know that we're no longer going to be silent, because our lives are really being stolen, where the women are going missing, they're being murdered. And And I'm seeing a real influx of change here where we're talking about it, but it really needs to have, everybody on board and say that this has got to stop, And so that's just something that I really think on. And there are so many days where I get another message that someone has told me that their cousin has gone missing or that their auntie got murdered. And this is happening, and more than you might see someone on the news, but probably for every person, there's so many other people behind there. And so this is what I really think about when I hear about stolen lives. As I said, this is a crisis that needs to be stopped. And so this is a lot of part of my work that I want to do, and I would do it regardless I would do it regardless if we're getting paid or not paid. This is about our lives. This is about our people. This is about our sisters, our aunties, our grandmas. And so that's something that I really, that I think on, and I think on a lot. So.
Thank you, Kendra. How about you, Jim?
Well, thank you very much. My roots go back to Kotzebue. My Inupiaq name is Akpayuk. I'm related to the Hensleys and Beavers and Steins and Schaefers. That's just a small group, but I have to say I am a stolen life. I was a product of a government program back in the day that forcibly took children from all of the communities and all of our villages into mission schools and boarding schools. And this happened, and this took place for about 4 generations. Literally tens of thousands of Native children were marched off to a whole variety of boarding schools, including the very first one in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and other places in the lower 48 and in Alaska. Personally, I'm the product of 2 boarding schools run by the BIA. One was Wrangell Institute in Wrangell, Alaska from 1955 to 1961. And of course, Mount Edgecombe High School from 61 to 65. I've had the opportunity to go into boarding school already speaking English. So I had a pretty good idea of what the rules were going to be. But so many of my contemporaries literally came to school not speaking any English whatsoever. And without being told what the rules were, they were beaten and hit and made to suffer all kinds of indignities for speaking their language. They were, we had the strap used on us. We ate lye soap. We were stuck in darkened closets. We were being put on high stools, wearing a dunce cap. I can still remember a gauntlet we had to run in Wrangell. I believe it was Thursday evenings, and it was a spectator sport. And children who racked up deficits were forced to get undressed, and run up and down a line of children who had been ordered to use their belts on our naked bodies. And this happened over and over and over and over. Many of these children didn't survive into adulthood. Many of them committed suicide. Many went to prison. Later in life, I had an opportunity to work in the Department of Corrections under the Tony administration. And I saw so many of my contemporaries and their children incarcerated. So there was intergenerational trauma. There were the impacts of colonization on so many of us in each generation. If you think about it, 40% of the state's inmate population is Alaska Native. Yet we only make up, maybe if we're lucky, 20% of the state's population. If you look at the children in foster care, over 60% of all the children in foster care are Alaska Native children. Our suicide rate is way above the national average. We murder each other by extraordinary percentages. And to me, this is all part and parcel of the experiences that we had because our lives were stolen. Our identities were stolen. And a lot of my contemporaries, thank God there were some areas of Alaska that had strong family systems. And they were able to go home in the summer into the loving arms of their parents and grandparents and communities, and were given just that extra shot of love and affection to arm them when they went back to boarding school. But there were so many other students that went back to communities that were already starting to disintegrate. And so not only were they experiencing trauma in the boarding schools, but they were coming home to villages that were also starting to break down. And I can't say enough about the impacts of colonization on Native people. And we're still being impacted today, in fact. And it's more subtle. And I have to appreciate Kendra for talking about some of that, because if you think about it, before contact, we had literally access to 100% of all the foods and the fish and the berries in Alaska. Just take fish, for example. Today, we're lucky if Indigenous people have access to only 3% of all the fish that come into Alaska every year, because 97% goes to the canneries and goes to sports fishing. And Kendra is right. We have to get permission. We have to wait for openings. We have to only catch a certain amount, and we have to record our take. And those are things that we never had to do before. A lot of men are emasculated, I think, because these laws took away the role that men played in our villages to a point where there's a disproportionate impact on men in all of our categories that you can mention. I know I'm kind of rambling around, but I wanted to get this opportunity to just kind of lay it out there. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing, Jim. And I think that you guys all just answered the first three questions that we had prepared for you. So I'm going to just skip ahead a little bit and feel free to come back to any of those other three questions if you feel you need to. But I wanted to go ahead and go into a couple of questions in. So I'll share my screen again. And I think you spoke a little bit about this, Jim, and a little bit Kendra, but what are some of the impacts of colonization, immigration, or adverse and traumatic experiences? I'd like to open that question up to anyone.
Could I start with that one? Is that all right? Okay. But anyone, please feel free to interrupt me if you have something to add. I won't be offended at all. And Jim, thanks so much for sharing it. That was like really amazing to hear a bit of your story. I really appreciate that. And Kendra, you as well, and Issa as well. Issa, sorry. So I just wanted to, I guess, touch on the impacts of trauma, adverse events, and I guess maybe just kind of give some definitions or talk about what that means. But before going into that, there are a lot of impacts of the things that Kendra, Issa, and Jim spoke about, and did I leave someone out? No. So it's not just the emotional, familial, community, psychologic impact, but actually on a genetic level even, and there are things that change. So you can imagine that the trauma that we experience, if you have chronic trauma that becomes unhealthy, you have higher levels of cortisol constantly and you're running through your body, and that affects your ability to fight off diseases, to fight off cancer. The inflammation that's going on in your body leads eventually to heart disease, stroke, heart attack, other issues. And this is, and we have an incredible amount of data on this to support this, and both in children and in adults, and with direct links to adverse childhood events or traumatic events, specifically happening in childhood. I mean, that's oftentimes where you see the greatest impact, because it does lead to genetic changes in the body, cellular level changes, as well as genetic changes over time. And that then can actually, some of that can be passed on from generation to generation. So this isn't just a mental issue that we're talking about, but there are significant and dramatic and life-changing, life-altering effects years down the line as a result of everything that we're talking about now. And it's really important to keep that in mind. Okay, so I kind of wanted to lay out kind of why it's so important to talk about these stressors, and the fact, when you have a very severe traumatic event, even if it's one event that happened at one time, that can actually change, especially in children, change your response to other events, even something that would otherwise be relatively minor. Now you're primed to have a more severe response. And so even one trauma, but what we're talking about here isn't just singular trauma. This is trauma that's happened across generations. And then kind of just to go back to the boarding school example, there's studies that show that even if, and this is true for immigration as well, immigrants, for example, children of parents who are immigrants, even if the children are first generation born in the US, they have much higher levels of stress in the past 4 years specifically, but worrying about their parents being deported, even if they haven't seen anyone, but if they've heard of a family member or a friend of the family who's been deported, this has long-lasting negative impacts on them. And similarly with boarding schools, even for children, now adults, whose parents went to boarding schools, they are something like 50% more likely to have major depressive disorder than children whose parents were not in boarding schools. And adults whose grandparents were in boarding schools are just a little bit more, it's like 54%, have a 54% higher rate of being depressed compared to children whose parents were not in boarding school. And I'm talking all within the Alaska Native American Indian population here. I'm not comparing other people groups, but it's just, and we don't talk about this. So I think it's really important and wonderful that we're all here talking about this, because this needs to be common knowledge. I will stop and leave the opportunity for someone else to say more.
Hi, this is Dorothy Shockley.
Hi, Dorothy.
Hi, thank you again for this opportunity. I really do appreciate it, and I really appreciate hearing others as well. I guess I want to share on a personal level in regards to my grandparents and my parents, and what I see as their their lives, or their stolen lives, I suppose, if you will. And I see it as their lives were stolen as Indigenous people, as, in Alaska Native, just everything about who they were as a person, as people, were stolen. Every aspect. You can't leave anything out. My grandparents, for the most part, were living a traditional lifestyle. A traditional family system was in place. And when they were told they had to go to school. My parents didn't go to boarding school, but, they went to mission schools my mother, anyway, in Tanana. They had a mission there and was scolded for speaking her language. I mean, I think about this, a 5-6-year-old going into a classroom and not being able to understand, the person who's talking, and not being able to speak her own language to try to communicate. I mean, the trauma of that in itself. And so therefore, and my dad went to school in Rampart, and he didn't talk much about that. I think he went to 3rd grade, but my mother did. But as she learned English, she became good friends with the deacons, I guess. But because of that, both of my parents chose not to pass on our language. They didn't teach us our language. So that in itself was stolen, our language. And we learned, a few words here and there, but nothing, because they didn't want us to go through what they did. And then, like I said, our whole, our traditional family systems. My older sisters and brother went to boarding school, and, looking at the things that they missed out on as far as a whole family system. They missed out on their relationships, the child. There's, because of the boarding schools and the missions, we have huge gaps in our child rearing, in our how we, relationships. Just everything. And, how to be a parent, how to be a mother, father, how to be a grandparent, all of those things were stripped. And then now relearning how to do those things and how to have, a traditional family system in place. So, yeah, there was just so much that was stolen in our lives. And now...
Thank you so much for sharing, Dorothy. I appreciate that. But in essence of time, just wanted to let you know that we have a Q&A session further on at the end of our discussion. And then we have a reflection discussion for everyone else next week too. Thank you for sharing, but I just wanted to jump back to our panelist speakers.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you, Dorothy. And so the question was, again, what are some of the impacts of colonization, immigration, or adverse and traumatic experiences?
I'll be happy to speak on this too. And I think, you don't have immigration that we're seeing today in refugees and asylees if you don't have colonization. Like, colonization is a global entity, right? So like, I'm looking at colonization as the root cause or for why we have conflict happening in Sudan, in Somalia, in Iraq, in, you know, Myanmar. Like these are not conflicts that came out of nowhere. We're talking about conflicts that are a result of colonization in Africa, that are the result of stolen lives taken from Africa and brought to these shores as slaves. This is the result of borders being drawn around places that borders should have never been drawn, because those were not traditional people that had lived together or like worked together, or no one had gone into, I mean, Sudan's a great example. Sudan's been in a civil war for a number of years, ultimately split into South Sudan, and we're still seeing fighting because that's a tribal state. I mean, there are over 500 unique tribes living in Sudan. And borders were haphazardly drawn by a colonizer to say you're now a country, right? And so I think these are like tied together issues. We see that in my world, certainly. And, you know, when I think about refugees and asylees, you know, we talk a lot about trauma. It's a big, you know, part of our discussion about how we provide services to individuals when they arrive here. And for refugees and asylees, we talk about it in what we call the triple trauma paradigm. Refugees and asylees go through 3 unique traumas. And I won't get in depth into, if people are really interested, they can look at the Center for Victims of Torture. They do the research on this. The first trauma they experience is the trauma that causes them to flee their country, right? So whatever happens in their home, whether that's the Civil War, whether that's a genocide, whether that's, you know, violence against you because of your religion or race or political party, that's an initial trauma. The secondary trauma is the flight that then causes you to leave your homeland, go on whatever journey you have to go through multiple countries, often in a very dangerous way where you're very vulnerable along that way. So the secondary trauma is the flight, and both of those make a lot of sense. But the third trauma is us. We are the third trauma. Resettlement. Welcome to America, where colonization still exists, where we still have systemic challenges in our justice systems, where like you show up here and we are the third trauma, right? You know, like even in what is supposed to be the like bright light moment for a refugee and asylee, you avail yourself to the southern border for protection after fleeing gang violence in the northern triangles, after traveling through Mexico with your children, through starvation, through challenges of medicine, and you're taken in and basically put into what it appears to almost look like a prison, right? And maybe you're kept with your family and maybe you're not, you're separated, you know? Ultimately, maybe you get your asylum claim approved after years and years of waiting in the judicial system for 6 or 7 years, and now you're supposed to restart your life, right? It's extremely complicated. And what I find in my line of work, and what I think is so true, is that despite all of that, I see resilience from the population I serve in a way that's beyond measure. Just amount of resilience to continue to persevere, to continue to move forward, continue to gain ground. And I think one of the things that is really important to me in that resettlement piece and us being the third trauma is that there are things we can do to improve those systems, to make the experiences of those that have experienced traumas easier. Like we can actually do things, you know, like one of the things we know is that refugee communities have a very hard relationship with law enforcement, often because law enforcement or military imposed what would have been the traumatic event in their life during some part of that. And so, you know, one of the things we do is ask APD to come to our refugee center every month, meet clients, you know, and the first time they came, we had to ask the officer not to come with a gun. And he was like, no, I have to carry my gun. And I was like, I really need you to not carry your gun. You know, like we had this really long, lengthy conversation. And so there are things that like here we can do, but like, we have to remember we're the trauma, you know, like, I think it's easy to like forget that sometimes. Like we are the living, breathing trauma for individuals that have come through colonization and immigration. And I think, you know, that's the whole point of having these discussions, right? Is like, we have to acknowledge that we are in fact the trauma. And then if that's true, what can we do to ensure that that individuals have an opportunity moving forward? What ownership do we have in systems to try to improve them?
Can I say something really quickly on that? I'm sorry, Jim and Kendra. But I love what Issa just said about like we are the trauma, because just speaking from BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and persons of color, you know, we all know that there are much higher rates of police violence, police brutality, incarceration, unequal application of law, et cetera. And some of the ways that this trauma continues is with school resource officers in the schools and, you know, policing the schools. And it's usually policing BIPOC individuals, not white people. And the same thing in hospitals. You know, all hospitals have security systems. And well, I think that there's a place for that. You know, there is a way to do things better. And I think, you know, these are schools are supposed to be sanctuaries. Medical centers are supposed to be sanctuaries. And we are actually taking that away from these sort of sacred places by having law enforcement, and school resource officers are actually law enforcement officers in those states. They carry guns, et cetera. So I appreciate what you said, and that kind of reminds me of that. So thank you. Sorry to jump in like that.
Any thoughts, Jim or Kendra?
What I'd like to add is, with all due respect to Issa, when you see the homeless people here in Anchorage and Fairbanks and Juneau, in my mind, those mostly are Alaska Native people, and many of them, in the way I look at it, they are our embedded refugees in our own country. And we have literally thousands of Native men and women on the streets in the state. Some are very visible, as we see here in Anchorage and Fairbanks, but there are so many other areas in Alaska where homelessness, multiple families living in one house is happening. What I'm interested in spite of the fact that I know all these things about ourselves, is we need a healthy discussion about how can we decolonize our relationship to our situation and find ways to become resilient and find ways to restore our culture, our language, our identity. And it's taken 200 years to get here by our colonizers, and it's not going to be solved overnight. So we really need to have a concerted effort by many of our groups, including the churches that were very much involved in this missionization, I call, of Alaska, but state and federal government as well. We need to figure out a way to decolonize and bring ourselves back to some sort of healthy state, or as someone mentioned, maybe it was kind of balance.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Jim. I want to recognize too what Dorothy was saying. You know, I appreciate sharing that story and thinking about the colonization, you know, that's happened, but looking at, as I mentioned before, we're returning to balance, and Jim said it as decolonization. There's this system set up that keeps us out of making decisions about our lands and our waters, and we set up this government structure that we never had and that we are not used to. And so when we look at people, when we're looking at, say, our legislature or anything, this more colonized system, and I can say this too, policy is an area that I worked a lot in. I've spent 15 years working in the policy world and seeing the things that really need to be changed. We don't have Alaska Native people sitting at the table making those decisions. We're left out. The tribes are left out of these conversations on what's happening on the lands, and are really just being yeah, they're not being consulted. We don't have those good relationships. And so and tribal sovereignty is not even hardly recognized, by our government structures. So we do need to talk about decolonizing. We need to talk about looking at our education system. When, I recognize I grew up, as an urban Alaska Native, I recognize, the privileges that I grew up with, and going through the public education system that I did, but recognizing we didn't even really touch at all on learning about Indigenous people in Alaska. I remember taking an Alaska history class, then I learned about Russia. And we need to be learning things that make sense to Alaska and to us. We need to be learning about hunting and fishing and bringing that back and into our education system that we had before colonization happened. That was such a rich education that needs to come back. When we think about decolonization, we need to center wellness. Wellness is something that's going to be core to everything. Jim had talked about the high suicide rates. We have high incarceration rates. There's that intergenerational trauma that needs to be addressed, and we need to center wellness in our work. And part of that, and a big part of that, is going to be living our traditional way of life and learning, again, for those that did not have the opportunity of hunting and fishing and being on the land and having that connection to our land, and that fills you up and gives you a whole nother sense of peace and a sense of being. I feel that even on my own, as I'm in Anchorage. To me, this is just, it's a very big city, and I can go home and it's a different feeling when I'm out on the Stickeen and I'm pulling in fish, and it kind of fills me back up. And so how can we work through that and bring us back to that balance? And it has to be everything. We have to be at these decision-making tables. We don't even recognize our tribes in our Constitution. We don't recognize in our tribes in our state statutes. We don't recognize Native people at all in this government system that we have. So something that I really feel passionate about is that we need to ensure that not just Indigenous people, but the BIPOC community needs to be at the decision-making tables. And how do we live our life in this balance? Well, it needs to change. We need to change the way that we're doing our government structures. We need to change so many different ways. And so that's something that I think on, that we really want to work on centering our wellness. And since I've joined with this Indigenous nonprofit, it's something that I've really appreciated. And we talk a lot about how do we take care of each other. We talk about, we have wellness goals. The way we center our work is just so different than the way that I spent my 15 years in policy, which, don't get me wrong, I love that too. But it's just a different way of thinking about it. And we prioritize our harvesting time. We prioritize our families. There's no apologizing for our kids running and jumping on us. Normally that would be happening right now, but grandma's helping me out tonight. So I just think that we need to restructure the way that our society is, center our family, center our spirituality, and our learning our language and our culture. And I think that we would see a culture shift, and where we might then remember basic things like respect, which I feel like are missing right now, especially in this political world that's really tough. but we need to be respectful of each other. And we need to first check on each other's wellness and how we're doing. We always center, our elders and our children. So even in this time in the pandemic, I call my grandmother all the time, and I have her, even though I have a 1-year-old son, she's only been got to see once so far, but we call and we FaceTime and we figure that out. But that's such a huge connection for me and our family. And that's just so incredibly important, I think. And that's something that we need to have as a whole system in our structure right now that we are really missing.
Oh, thank you all for that response. That was really informative. I'm going to go back to our questions here, share my screen. I think that we spoke a bit about it already, just kind of touched on it, but how do some of these traumas impact or influence culture?
I'll go first here because I just heard Kendra say something that made my head just go, oh, that's the, I think it's been said, but like to me it was really highlighted, is that when we're talking about stolen lives, when a life is stolen, it impacts the culture because it impacts the family unit. And when the family unit is impacted, you lose the bearers of your culture. And we see that, the community I work in, we definitely see that reflected. If you see immigration or resettlement happening, you often see young people come without their elders, their tradition bearers, like the individuals that traditionally have held the language or taught the language or are the storytellers in their homes. That's true for a number of our families. And so, when a family unit, when a life is stolen and it's taken, it impacts an entire family unit because that's what we're centered around. And I think as humans, we're centered around that, and family can be broad and it can be used in multiple ways. I'm not just talking about a nuclear family. I'm talking about, that can be a village in some, cultures. That could be, your neighbors, that could be your friends, that could be your parents, right? And, 2 years ago, get to one of the best parts of my job is that one of the things I get to do is when we have a family tie come, and that means it's a family member coming to join their family here. And 2 years ago, we resettled a 101-year-old grandmother from the Congo. And when I picked her up at the airport, and I was with the interpreter, and she came to be reunited with her grandchildren and her children that were here. And one of the things that I think was really important in that is someone said to me, well, she's 101. And it was kind of like this, like, really, is she going to be resettled? But the point is that a life is a life is a life. And a 101-year-old grandmother deserves to be with her family, to be with her grandchildren, to be with her great-grandchildren, to be together with them, to have that healthy family unit. And we have found that when, individuals, especially in refugee and immigrant communities, who I serve, so that's what I know the most about. When a population goes through a genocide, like we saw happen in the Darfur region, for example, or other regions, and you have just this generation of young boys left without any culture bearers, they don't know who they are because they're looking for someone to teach them. And those voices have been silenced. And I think, I think that's one of the main elements that can be very challenging, especially in the work that I see, because rarely is a family unit resettled together. Typically, these are separated families, and you come alone or in your small nuclear family, and it has serious impacts in the ability to preserve your language, to preserve your religion, traditional dress, food. Like all of those things aren't located here, and it's a great challenge to them, and it's traumatic.
Thank you, Issa. Any thoughts from our other panel speakers? Like I said, I think we covered a lot of that in our last couple of questions. So if you don't mind, I'll just move on to the next question and I'll share my screen here again. Here's a good one. What are some solutions for the next generation?
I feel like I touched on this a little bit when we talk about solutions. And I think about how do we really integrate our Indigenous cultures into our education system? How do we sorry, I just kind of want to think on this a little bit more. It's also learning our languages is something that's been important, and revitalizing our languages, recognizing the lands that we are on. I think that there's so many different things that our generations now and into the future can be doing. And we talked about decolonization. It's conversations that I'm in a lot, and we work with a number of different organizations and a number of different people where we have these conversations about decolonizations and about racism and discrimination, and putting those conversations out there and having them. We have them with our with the Anchorage Police Department, and we've talked about how can we bring more culture and into those spaces, and they've been inviting us in. And so having these conversations with everyone and trying to like share stories, I think is some of the things that I feel like that needs to happen into the future. And so just a few thoughts.
Yeah, I'd like to give you the benefit of some of my experiences as a professor at the university. Most of my students were Alaska Native students, but I taught over at Alaska Native or the Alaska Native Studies Department. In that 9 years, I averaged 3 courses a semester, 2 semesters times 9 years, and I did a cursory check of the number of students I had, and I would say about close to 1,000 Native students went through my classes, and almost every experience I had with my students from as Alaska Native students is that many of them came really not knowing much about their own culture, their own history, and many of them were also just as surprised and to learn about themselves from my having taught many of them. And of course, it always went back to, how come I didn't learn this in high school? How come I didn't learn this back home? And that led me to think and believe that, kind of building on what Kendra was saying, is we need to, part of the solution problem has to be with reclaiming our school districts, reclaiming our classrooms, and reclaiming exactly what we're going to be teaching these children in a way that enforces their culture and their language and their identity. Because right now it's hit and miss. Some rural school districts are doing a wonderful job, but just as many are not. And there needs to be policymakers, legislators, administrators that need to figure out a way to, how can we change that narrative? How can we put more resources into putting traditional people in the classroom and telling those stories that really are so important.
Thank you, Kendra. Thank you, Jim. As you were talking about that, I'm thinking about the pandemic, you know, and how many of our students are learning from home at this point. And oh my goodness, it's been a little bit of a trying time for me to homeschool our 6-year-old. But you know, with that, there's also great opportunity, and I think that thank you for sharing. That's something. It's maybe the silver lining. Any thoughts, Issa and Dr. Biskup?
Toni, just call me Toni. Yeah, I think it's really important to stress the decolonization because it, as we've all sort of spoken to, it's global, right? It's not just here on native lands. It's across the world. It's happening today, and with pretty severe consequences. So I really appreciate everything that you all have said, and I think it's, you know, it's an excellent point, and that is kind of overall the goal is decolonization, and how do we do that? And Jim, you bring up an excellent point about the schooling. You know, we've been lied to our whole lives, and our parents and our grandparents have all been lied to, and for generations before that even. And you know, it's a disservice not only to BIPOC but also to white folks, because you know, nobody wants to live their lives drenched in lies, right? And there's many other reasons why it's bad, but the more we know, the better. Education, truth is empowerment, and especially when it comes to knowing about yourself and your family and your history. And I'm a physician. I'm also a linguist, by the way, before I went into medicine. But so, you know, I guess kind of coming from a health standpoint, it's critical. Like there's so much that you lose. You lose some health, some aspects of your health, physical and mental, when you don't have those connections. And that is part of, you know, kind of answering the question of resilience, like how can we address this? And so I think globally thinking about decolonizing and what does that mean? And I think, as Jim said, and Kendra, you know, that education has to be a place, and that we start in education from the beginning of when children enter school, and that will require policy changes that won't happen without a big fight. But we have to be willing to do that. I think it's necessary, you know, to kind of fight for what's right and what's true. And I just lost my train of thought. I wanted to say something else. Oh, well, in academia, there's academic colonialism, and I have been using this term for years, because you see this in medicine and you see this in the university system. And Jim, I don't know, I'm interested to hear what you've experienced being a professor, but you know, it's to who gets promoted and which scholars have their research published. And you know, there are brilliant scholars all over the world in low resource countries. There are brilliant people in medicine and science and education in every field who are doing incredible work, but they won't even get a glance, not even a first glance, by big name journals that are primarily published in the West. And this is part of academic colonialism, and those people, you know, lose out. We lose out. Maybe we could have had the cure for cervical cancer, or you know, the preventive cure for cervical cancer years and years ago, before now. I mean, there's so many. There's just a lot of lost potential for everybody, and so I think addressing that, recognizing it, number one, addressing it, and then one of the questions, I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, but like what can we do? What's the one thing that we can do? And so I think decolonization, but also thinking about sanctuaries, creating sanctuaries, and that means different things. But but I think it ultimately means letting people be who they are and connect with who they are culturally, individually, linguistically, letting people connect with who they are and having that space to do so freely and safely without being judged, without being the victim of racism, etc. So, okay, I feel like I'm talking a lot. I'm going to stop.
You're a speaker. You can talk. Thank you. Thank you for that. Any thoughts, Issa?
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I just think one of the things that's really fascinating to me is that, you know, power in many ways in the US is centered in policy, right? And Kendra's spoken a lot about policy, it's centered in government. And if you look at our government, it's not representative of the populations we're talking about as the individuals that are serving in our, you know, don't have to look much further than our local governments to our state government. And then definitely on the federal level, we certainly don't see the reflection of what this country looks like represented in the national bodies of the Senate or the House, right? But what's interesting to me is we're talking about decolonization. I mean, our government is so colonized, like it is the epitome of colonization. And we are, and so to participate, to be elected to the House or to be elected to the Senate, it is in some ways it's really fascinating, like to be a decision maker, to be a policy maker, to be a whatever, is in some ways asking people to change their, not change, I don't know if that's the right word, but it forces you to learn outside of maybe your traditional values, because maybe that wasn't the way you governed back home. And I started by saying, you know, I was so fascinated by this nonprofit trying to, you know, convince Sudanese refugees to create a nonprofit. And they were saying, we're fine by ourselves. We don't need your government. We don't need your policy. We don't need your nonprofits. What we need is one another, and we already have it. But, you know, it's this really challenging thing, because if we really want to see some political policy changes, we need those voices also represented at the table. And they say that table was never for us because that table wasn't made by us, right? And so, like, you know, it's like here we are in the midst of an election, which like has huge impacts for a lot of populations. You know, I can't, you know, like I'm emphasizing to our new citizens that I serve, like vote. It's really important to vote in a system that's so broken because it's not decolonized in any way. It is a system of colonization, you know, that governs us. And so, you know, I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. And I don't know if that's answering this question well. It's just simply like one of the greatest challenges is constantly, you know, we're asking people to step into roles that like the system wasn't made for them to step into. And they bring these great talents, great skills. Academia is an example of that. Government's an example of that. And then they get there and they're not respected, right? And they have probably the ideas that could change and fix the problems we're talking about. But the system is so colonized that their voices are being drowned out, even when they're sitting at the table in front of us. And that, you know, that I think Jim said this is going to take a long time to fix. And I think he's right, you know, and doesn't mean it's not a worthy cause to keep chipping away at and keep fighting at. But I think, you know, I don't want to sound radical, but like we have to just change the way even we're doing this. Like it's not enough. It's not enough to elect people into offices that were made by colonization. It's not enough. We're going to see.
I don't think that's radical. I don't think that's radical.
Okay, good.
Okay, it looks like we have about 10, 12 minutes left. So I did want to save some time for all of our listeners to ask questions, to get engaged with our panel speakers. So if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to do so now. Any questions, comments, concerns from our meeting attendees?
Yeah, this is Don in Kodiak. Yeah, listening to this, and
I posted a question on the chat, and I was wondering if anybody would comment, one of the speakers would comment on it, which is in regards to subsistence. In a nutshell, is subsistence a job, and what's the real meaning of a job? Because I think that in many cases that people without jobs, that this gets so complicated, that society recognizes they don't exist because they don't have a job, but yet all of our jobs are for the sole purpose of subsisting, basically. And I think that's one of the problems with the inequities in this society, is that we think about jobs and the economy in ways that don't include a lot of people. It's, like the starving artist in the garret. That's supposed to be a big deal. You're supposed to go through this suffering. Why not just be an artist in a garret? I think Yang had a fairly good idea with giving people enough money to live on so they could pursue their life, not necessarily their dream, but their life. And jobs get in the way sometimes, or the way we think about jobs get in the way. And I think it gets in the way of how we think about indigenous populations too.
I'd like to respond to that. Thank you, Genevieve. First of all, we start with a deficit because we're always having to use the white man's word for a way of life that we have to defend. And that word is subsistence. It's something as Native people we don't generally think about when we are hunting and fishing and gathering, because it's more than just putting food on the table, but it's creating community, and it's creating relationships, and it's creating harmony and cooperation. And it is valued as someone who is a provider. And the Western system, the Western world, looks down on that word subsistence, and they conflate it with not having an adequate job. But I really disagree. I think our way of life, the process of hunting and fishing and gathering speaks volumes about our values to each other and to our families and to our communities. And I think we need to be proud of saying,
I think you should be. I don't disagree with you. I think you should be proud. I don't disagree with you. I think we use that. I think the words are wrong. I think it disrespects your way, a way of life. It puts that word subsistence on it when it's not, and tries to equate it to a job, doesn't equate it to a job, and therefore diminishes the values you're talking about, which are really the values that I think most people are after.
Very good. Yeah, I agree.
Don, would you like to pose your question?
There we go. Yeah, I don't even know where to begin. Several years ago, as I was on the Voc Rehab Committee, and I noticed there was this distinct problem every time we went to some place like Barrow, now Itkavik. And what I realized is that our ideas of community were different. Our Western idea of a community was a geographic location, but the local idea of a community was the people. And then the committee didn't really respect the community, and they kept wondering why nobody would come to visit and speak at the meetings. And it's a lot of times because we didn't bring in the tribal leaders to run the meetings, so nobody could get permission to speak. And it's like, you know what, if you just brought somebody in and made them an honorary head or a chair or a member, and they could do that, and that would start happening, but they didn't want to hear that. But this whole thing of jobs is something that I've been thinking about myself for some time. And in our society, employees are second-class citizens, workers are second-class citizens. And if you take a look at the whole process of economic development, you have money going into job creators, and they'll start a business, and then they'll hire local people and not pay them very much. They'll pay them part-time wages and for part of the year until money runs out or until they stop making money. And I think we need to work with the education system really where we're not creating workers. We shouldn't be creating workers. We should be creating leaders and getting people to respect their talents, their genius, because I see it across the board, across races and genders and various genders, where we just generally do not respect people's genius and talent. And I see it all over the place. And we start valuing that and allowing them to value what they bring to the table, that'll start happening. But it begins with our education system that we have to work on.
Thank you, Don. Any thoughts from our panel speakers?
I mean, I'll just say that I think when you think about colonization and you think about capitalism is colonization, right? Like it came from that idea. You know, capitalism was formed out of partly ideals that were brought over from, you know, Western culture and put here. But I mean, if you just hold like, you know, colonization, capitalism up, it just reveals all the flaws in our system. And, you know, that's education, housing, you know, Jim talked about homelessness. Education is a flaw, housing's a flaw, food insecurity is a flaw, like, you know, medical access, like if you hold up, there's all these other flaws, the criminal justice system. These are all a result of that same, you know, problem. Like these are not issues that are alone or standing alone. They're a reflection of, you know, the same, I don't know what to call it, a virus, like a virus within our society, right? And so I think it's just I've heard so many good things here from the other panelists that just make me go, yeah, I mean, it's like added to another very complicated spider web of interlocking pieces of where, and to Don's point, we're all really talented in different ways, and we've all had very different life experiences. And so when I look at this very intricate spider web, I often feel very overwhelmed and say, like, what do we do now? And Don just said people are very smart, intelligent, and genius in their own right and in their own skill sets and in their own way of approaching a problem or viewing something. And we all can approach the part of the intricate spiderweb that we understand, that's the area we know, the area we can work towards resolving or working towards healing in that part of our community that we serve in some capacity. And if we could all do that collaboratively instead of competitively, perhaps we could take some steps forward. And so I'm like, I don't know how I even ended up being a panelist on this. I'm grateful I am here, but not really because of anything I'm saying, but because of the things I'm hearing, because that's the way we're actually going to do this, you know, is like hear from one another in different sectors so that we can start to attack all these little pieces of the puzzle that fall underneath colonization that have inflicted all these like really poor health outcomes for the people we care about, the people that are our neighbors that live here. And we want I want a healthy community, not a healthy me, you know, and in order to do that, we all have to use the skills and abilities we have and bring to the table with our talents and traditions to try to find some solutions to that.
Thank you, Issa. It looks like we have some questions in the chats here. There is one from Penny, right? I saw it. Where'd it go? Oh, there it is. And this one's for Jim. What do you have to advise to survivors in terms of communicating their trauma, healing, and gaining understanding in relation to boarding schools?
That is a good question. I would begin with having family discussions, because chances are there are people within our own family, whether they be parents or grandparents, aunts and uncles, that may have experienced boarding school, and then to have a discussion with them about their experiences. And then if there's more in a community that's willing to have a community discussion, then I would recommend that communities set aside time and have a community discussion, because the boarding school era impacted not just individual family members, but it impacted almost everyone in every village. I can still remember hearing stories of parents who said there was an eerie quiet in the village because there was no longer any children in the village. They were all gone. And they were all gone to mission schools and boarding schools. and BIA schools, and parents had nothing to do. And they needed to fill their time, and that was traumatic to them as well, not just to the student. And so there needs to be an opportunity for parents and grandparents to come together with their children and grandchildren and have these discussions. To me, that would begin the healing process.
Thank you, Jim. Okay, it looks like we're nearing the end of our time here. I just wanted to invite any of our panel speakers to share some closing thoughts. Hopefully some maybe positive optimism that we can look forward to. This was a heavy discussion, a lot of discussion about trauma, which is good to get out, but I also want to leave our listeners and to leave myself with something a little upbeat and something to look forward to. And I also wanted to share really quick that we have another reflection debrief discussion scheduled for next week, same time, for about an hour, for us to continue this conversation and to allow our listeners, attendees, to be a little bit more active in the conversation. But thank you to our panel speakers, and please, just wanted to ask for some closing remarks from our panel speakers.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I guess something positive that I think a lot about too is my favorite role in life is being a mama. And so what are those things that I can pass to my kids? And I'm going to teach them how to fish. I mean, teach them how, go and pick berries. And we are trying to learn our language together. These are things that I can pass down to my kids that they can then pass down to their kids. It's something that is so sacred, and that is such a positive thing in my life that I always try to make time for. And I feel like, if we all do this, we share our experiences and we come together as our communities. And of course, when we come together, we love to share our food, and let's talk about it. Let's be well together. And I think every day about what are these changes that I can make. So for me, there might be changes with my kids, but also with the partners and in the work that I do. And as we come together, all of these changes, I think, will be added up to be big things, and something that I also think about is I know it's a colonized system that we're in, and I always try to strategize and think on, well, how can I go into this colonized system and work on changing it? And so I want to bring all of these people, and like these conversations are kind of where it helps to start. So we all have these ideas. We want to take over the system and change it. Well, let's do that. We got to come together. We got to think about how we do that. And it seems kind of odd sometimes to tell people like, okay, go in the system that really doesn't work for you and doesn't look and isn't comfortable for you, but I want you to go do that. I want you to go run for office. And they're like, oh, but if we all do this, we can try to think about ways that we can make those changes together instead of continuing to try to, I guess I'm thinking about how do we go in and change it from the inside, I guess, and bring our wellness and bring our values and the way that we live and bring that into our government and bring that into our families and make it, normalize our spirituality, normalize putting our families first. And so that's something that I think about in the ways that I live. And I appreciate being here. I appreciate learning from all of you. And Hawa.
Thank you, Kendra.
Well, I know we're out of time, so thanks everyone for staying late. And also, I am very grateful to have some space here and to talk and to listen to everyone else. So thank you so much for that. I wanted to, I guess, leave with the positive thoughts I wanted to leave with were the fact that resilience is something that most of us have access to in a variety of ways, and it serves really well to maybe not undo the trauma, but mitigate the damage that these traumas can cause, cultural, historical, physical, emotional, etc. So, and some of the things, you know, if they're, since we're all adults here, if one of us can be a positive force in a child's life, then if they have no other positive adult relationships in their life, Kendra, speaking with, you know, about your daughter, I mean, that's huge. And Jim, for all of your students, I'm sure that you are that for many of them and have been over the years that you've been working in your role, and Issa as well for a lot of the refugees and particularly children. I mean, I guess clinically where it's most impactful is in terms of making changes in children, but even just having one adult relationship, if a child has one adult relationship that's positive, then that can mitigate a lot of the effects of many, many traumas that they have going on, including cultural and historical trauma. And then I think for all of us too, as we work with people, everybody has a trauma story, some, you know, more involved than others, but making sure that we listen, that we're curious, that we don't force anything. No one has to say what they don't want to. So I think kind of being aware of that, that's something that every single one of us can do as we interact with other people, is just to listen and be open and curious and compassionate. And there's, I wanted to just leave with, there's a woman, a Professor Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart. I wonder, Jim, have you, yeah, she's done a ton of work in Indigenous trauma, historical trauma for, I don't know, 20 or 30 years. And so she has a lot of good work out there on that. If anyone is interested in further reading, I think she's specific to Indigenous peoples. I think she's an excellent place to go and look. Okay, sorry, I'll stop now.
I'd like to add to Tony's commentary by just letting you know that I'm on a national board called the National Native Boarding School Healing Coalition, NABS for short, we call it NABS, because it is a long title, National Native Boarding School Healing Coalition. So if you were to Google it, you will see that our organization is in the process of trying to get our government to acknowledge their role and responsibility in putting hundreds of thousands of American Indians and Alaska Natives through a century or more of boarding school, very similar to the Truth and Reconciliation that Canada did for their experience, as well as on the same wavelength as the Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa and New Zealand and Australia. So there is a as we understand, this happened globally, and different parts of our globe are actively finding ways to heal, and I'm glad to say I'm part of a group that's trying to do it for the States. So check it out.
Thank you, Jim.
Yeah, I'll just really quick, because since I know we're out of time, is I'll say take every opportunity you can in your personal life to decolonize when you have the opportunity. So, you know, I get to be a director and a state refugee coordinator, and what that means is I, you know, administer a refugee resettlement program, and 70% of the staff that work in my office are former refugees or immigrants themselves. And, you know, our job descriptions used to require you to have a bachelor's degree and a high school diploma, and we took that stuff off there, because what does a bachelor's degree teach you that life experience, if you came here as a refugee, doesn't teach you? And if you have life experience and you have skills and you have abilities, then why do you need a bachelor's degree? And the answer is you don't. You do not need a bachelor's degree, and you don't need a high school diploma from this country to be a kind person, to provide service to your neighbor, to help a person walk a path that you have already walked in your life. And so in every opportunity you are in, look around you. There is something you can change today. Like we're not going to change perhaps, the makeup of our government, but there is something today in your little tiny world that you can change that makes the difference in making sure that more of those voices are elevated. And we all have that responsibility, and there's more we can always do, but I think that that's an easy place to start.
Yay! Thank you all, Kuya Nakbak, for taking time. I appreciate it so much, and thank you from Community Connects. On behalf of Community Connects, we really appreciate your time and expertise to share with us and everyone else. So again, we have a debrief meeting next week. We encourage you all to check that one out. We have a lot more to talk about, it feels like, so that would be a good place to redirect that energy. And thank you. I just wanted to say thank you all, Kuya Nakbak, and we'll see you at the debrief.